Welcome to the 2021 Business for Peace Spotlight Series, Rethinking Systems of Decent Work. I am Fiona Reynolds. I'm the CEO of the Principles for Responsible Investment, or PRI, and I'm really delighted to be the moderator for today's session. So each May, Business for Peace hosts its annual summit, including the Business for Peace Award ceremony. However, due to the coronavirus pandemic, along with many other organisations, Business for Peace has had to postpone their 2020 summit and decided to host an exciting new digital event series as a scaled down version of the usual events. And in line with their vision to recognise, inspire and accelerate business-worthy leadership, Business for Peace will continue to host a series of discussions about current global issues affecting sustainability and ethical business leadership. So today I am really pleased to welcome you to this panel discussion. We're going to be talking about rethinking systems of decent work and focusing on SDG 8, which of course is decent work and economic growth. So just for some context about today's discussion, I think there's no doubt that the socio-economic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic have been severe, exposing existing vulnerabilities and really exacerbating inequalities. Those with unstable incomes and little to no social protections have been pushed deeper into poverty. Women around the world have been left more vulnerable due to job and income losses, but also to higher risk of domestic violence and abuse. School disruptions and the disappearance of some entry-level jobs, internships and job training programs have also marginalised many youth and left some feeling uncertain about the future. In building back better, and if we are to succeed, then all stakeholders really need to come together to ensure that current work systems, labour markets and employment opportunities are fair, that they offer social protections and ensure decent living wages and decent working conditions. They need to be resilient and flexible, designed really to protect workers as opposed to only thinking about profit maximisation. So today our panel will focus on that issue of how governments, the private sector, unions, the civil sector can work together to address challenges arising from the pandemic and to re-establish better systems for decent work. So I'm really delighted to be joined by an absolutely fantastic panel. So I have with me today Roger Bjørnstad, who's the Chief Economist at the Norwegian Confederation of Trade Unions, Guy Ryder, who's the Director General of the ILO, the International Labour Organization, Felicitas Pantoja, the CEO and founder of Coffee for Peace, and last but not least, Paul Polman, who's the co-founder and chair of Imagine. So we're going to have what I hope is a fantastic panel discussion, and you'll hear from all of our panelists, but we also want to involve the audience, and we want to have the chance for you to ask questions. So please make sure that you send through your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try and answer as many of them as possible. So I'm going to ask a quick opening question to all of my panelists. I'll start with Guy. In lots of the discussions at the moment, we keep talking about building back better. From where you sit, do you think that's happening? Are we building back better? What have you seen happening over the last year and a half?
Well, thanks very much, and thank you for the question. I think the point is we do have to take seriously this becoming rather cliched phrase of building back or even building forward better. We all have to do that. Is it happening yet? I don't think so, for two reasons. One is that a large part of the world is still deep in the pandemic, and its economic and social consequences are still hitting people very, very hard. And just to remind everybody what the size of the hit has been to the world of work. Last year, 255 million full-time job equivalents lost in the world. Okay, we're growing back, but we're still way behind where we started from in quantitative terms. And then on the qualitative front, this better future of work that we want, I think the debates are just beginning. I'm not at all convinced that we have a clearly identified program of recovery either identified internationally or nationally to build back better. And what worries me particularly, you've alluded to one of the things, is the fact that not only has this pandemic laid bare very brutally the pre-existing inequalities and vulnerabilities, this pandemic has deepened those inequalities and vulnerabilities. And the more dangerous thing, I think, looking forward, is that the trajectory of recovery is so uneven. The richer countries, the more advanced economies bouncing back really remarkably quickly and with the resources to boost that recovery. The same is not true in the developing world. So the problem is, I think, that this increase of inequality is not just a blip on the screen in the course of the pandemic, but something that could be with us for some time going forward. Therefore, my conclusion is that we actually have to turn our minds very consciously and very deliberately to policies that will shift the needle and enable us to build back better collectively. I don't think that's happening yet. I think we still have the opportunity to do it, but it is up to not just governments, but I think business and workers to put us on a new trajectory. And I could go into all sorts of areas, and I hope the conversation will take us in this direction of how we need to actually make that difference and make the future of work better.
Fantastic, thanks, Guy. And we'll come back and talk about this in far more detail. So, Paul, what's your view from where you're sitting?
Yeah, not much different from Guy. I think COVID has exacerbated the risks and vulnerabilities that have been building in our global economy. People have realized now that you can't have healthy people on an unhealthy planet. I think more people are starting to see the relationships between biodiversity, human health, the economy, climate change, inequality, with the tragic death of George Floyd, the racial overtone. So the awareness have definitely come up. But where I agree strongly with Guy is where, although we see some bright lights, we are still long on words and short on action. I don't think people fully realize the speed and scale that we need in terms of our economic transition. And that promises for 2050 are theoretically fine, but it's actions between now and 2030 that count. I mean, this is a major change that needs to happen in the global economy beyond what we've ever seen before. We failed to do that during the financial crisis about 12 years ago, when people felt that banks were too big to fail, but people were too small to matter, and only about 5% of the total spending went into right-sizing the global economy. We still need to address these issues of climate change and inequality as being the most important ones. The priorities are enormous. The governments have spent $16 trillion combined just to save lives and livelihoods. The global GDP has suffered to the tune of $22 trillion. I think more and more people are starting to realize that the cost of inaction, or if you want to call it the cost of our failures, is significantly higher than avoiding these issues in the first place. Now, are we spending enough money or not? There are some encouraging signs. About 30% of the spending that we now see moving forward is actually towards greening the global economies, towards providing better social structures and safety nets, towards stimulating the industries of the future, but that is nowhere near enough. We have to strengthen first and foremost our healthcare systems in most of the countries. Look what is happening now in India, and red lights are going on in Africa as we talk. We need to restore growth and deliver the jobs of the future. It is very unfortunate that COVID has moved probably 150 million people back into extreme poverty. We've lost the equivalent of 400 million jobs. So the social cohesion, especially jobs amongst the young, the women, the vulnerable, is going to be an enormous priority as we move forward. And then we need to address the inequality. It is incredible again that during COVID, the billionaires got $3.9 trillion more, whilst the workers lost $3.7 trillion. That inequality has only gone up. And if we don't really address that now once and for all and strongly, I think we're going to see significantly more problems in the future. And then finally, living within our planetary boundaries, the biodiversity loss, the climate change, the environmental degradation, if you want to, needs to be addressed. Now, the good thing is, very quickly, is that governments are starting to move. I'm very encouraged by the European Green Deal, by the Farm to Fork, biodiversity, circular economy packages. Many of them have a just transition component in there. We see now with the Biden administration, the US back at the table, infrastructure projects that go in the right direction. We see other countries stepping up. A year ago, we had about 20% of the world making climate commitments, as an example. Now we have 75% of the world making climate commitments. So I'd say we are at a C minus at the moment in terms of high on intentions and still low on action. And this is a year that is going to be very important. We have the COP26 in Glasgow, obviously. We have the G7, G20s. We have the COP15 on biodiversity in Kunming. So we need to show now with collectively the private sector, government, civil society alike, that we can move forward at accelerated pace, and the world would be so much better for it.
Thanks, Paul. Felicitas, what about from where you're sitting? What's your view? What do you think?
Well, this COVID-19 exposes the great disparity of the privileged and non-privileged. And we can see that here in our country, wherein a lot of people lost their job because of COVID, and a lot of farmers cannot move their goods to the market because of blockage and not permitting to travel. And we are suffering in terms of increasing COVID cases in our country now. We thought we just had this vaccination moving on, but then we have this Indian strain virus that was discovered, and now everybody is in panic, and they closed some of the places in our country, especially here in Mindanao, wherein it's locked down again. So we don't know how we can last this, especially small businesses who lost their opportunity to create wealth or create money for their family. So it's really, how long can we do our innovation if the prolonged lockdown and COVID situation are here? So our country are not prepared.
Okay, thanks, Felicitas. I love your backdrop, by the way. I wish I was there. I wish I was looking at that view. Roger, I want to come to you, come to the other end of the spectrum, a very developed, wealthy country in Norway. What are you seeing from your perspective?
Well, I think it's, of course, too early to judge the aftermath of the crisis and the building up, because we are still in the midst of the crisis. But I agree with Paul and Guy, and actually I'm quite optimistic also. I think actually the crisis has increased awareness, of the role of public sector, the role of welfare systems. A lot of workers have increased their, their meaning of work, and actually also the governments have been more aware of the value of social dialogue. That's at least what we experience. We have had a lot, 3 decades of market economy thinking, reducing taxes rather than increasing demand, building down welfare systems, accepting increased wage differentials. So we have. You might say that this crisis might change course in the years ahead, and we are actually able to build up a new, so to speak, economic systems built on worker rights, equality, increasing welfare, and increasing public sectors. And we see the initiatives from Biden Janet Yellen has taken an initiative to increase corporate taxes worldwide, and the reason is, of course, that we need to finance our welfare systems, and we have to break the spiral of the race to the bottom. So yes, we are in the midst of a crisis and everything looks quite black right now, but I think actually we see an increasing awareness of the communities and the meaning of social politics.
Thank you. So that's a good overview about what everyone's thinking, where we are. I now want to sort of start thinking about some of the solutions, some of the things that we need to do. So Guy, I want to come back to you really to start thinking about and focus on systemic reform to ensure that we do have better worker protection going forward. So as we've been saying, a lot's really happened over the last year and a half. But what changes have countries adopted in their social protection systems since the COVID-19 pandemic? And what type of support systems are needed to ensure that all countries implement social protection systems for the most vulnerable workers and workers in, the gig economy, for example? How can we really assist countries to invest more in social protection systems?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Well, look, what we've seen over the last 15 months has been an extraordinary level of and Roger's just referred to it, of public intervention, state intervention, done on a very, very rapid and ad hoc basis to protect people against the worst effects of the pandemic. Now, the health measures are one thing, but if we look at the economic and social space, what we've seen is an enormous number of ad hoc interventions to provide social protection of different types to people in very urgent, if not desperate, need of it. Our calculations show, and our survey work shows, that we've been able to record about 1,600 separate ad hoc measures of additional social protection in the course of the last 15 months. And that's brought assistance to about 645 million people. It's an extraordinary performance. But what does that tell us about the pre-existing circumstances of social protection? Well, it shows us very, very clearly that the world was badly underperforming in respect to providing universal social protection, even the most minimum levels of social protection to people. Again, it's about 7 out of every 10 people in the global population are not covered or only very partially covered by social security. And therefore, we had to have this rush to ad hoc sticking plaster actions in respect of social protection. Now, what happens next is the question. Now, one thing that could happen, and it's what I think none of us wish to see happen, is that these ad hoc measures are withdrawn as the intensity of the economic and social impact of the pandemic recedes, and we sort of go back to where we were before. Basically, a return to the status quo ante and the unsatisfactory situation that we had. The option is we learn something from this crisis and say, look, this level of pre-existing social protection was entirely unsatisfactory. And if we're serious about preparing for the next crisis and building resilience into our labor markets and our societies, we really do have to take the challenge of providing universal social protection seriously. This isn't something that we've talked about just because of the advent of the pandemic. It's been talked about for decades, and we've done some of the mathematics about what it would take, and we know that the annual cost of providing basic social protection floors to low-income countries annually, the international funding gap, if you like, is about, it's just about, well, I should say for the developing world, it's about 1.1 trillion. For the lowest income countries, it's only 78 billion. I say only, but it is only because, the IMF tells us that over the last 15 months, $16 trillion have been spent in fiscal measures or announced in fiscal measures. So here's my point. We've known pre-pandemic what it would cost us to provide more universal social protection in the world. And we've chosen not to spend that money. It's a deliberate policy choice. We didn't think it was important enough. We thought the bill was too high. And I hope that this pandemic might have allowed us to rethink that political decision and say we cannot afford not to spend this money. Now, that said, there's a couple of extra points to be made. One is that we have a continuing, it sounds semantic, but it is not, but a continuing debate about what we need to put in place, whether they are safety nets, which is a lot of the current parlance in some international organizations, so that when you start to fall, someone's going to catch you, or whether we have more comprehensive social protection systems, which actually regard social protection as a right, something permanent, something you can rely on. There is a qualitative difference between these two ideas. And I think that needs to be thought through. And the second thing I think we need to say is we really do need to consider this a global responsibility. You know, we know that the least developed countries have a lower capacity in terms of resources to make all of this happen. We know that that 16 trillion that's been spent in crisis response, you know, it's been skewed massively to those countries which have had the resources to invest. Those in most need of social protection just haven't been able to mobilize resources. So there is an international solidarity piece to this. I don't want to go on too long. You've mentioned gig workers.
Yeah.
You know, we all worry a great deal and wring our hands about the fact that gig workers, even in the most developed social protection countries, they've fallen through the cracks because their employment status is unclear, or there is a mismatch between the lived and worked realities and the institutions that we have built to provide social protection. But I wouldn't want us to focus uniquely on gig workers. They certainly need to have attention. What about those 2 billion informal economy workers at the other end of the scale? 6 out of every 10 workers works in informality in the world. And they really, you know, if they have been forgotten in the past, my goodness, what we're seeing happening in India and other parts of the developing world means they should not be forgotten any longer.
Thanks, Guy. That was really good points. Paul, I now want to turn to thinking about building sustainable business models and really more ethical labour practices, picking up on all of the points that Guy just made. So we've seen a mix of business responses when it comes to worker protection during this pandemic, and certainly from my perspective, from the investor side, we have as well. But from your perspective, have organisations, businesses really lived up to their CSR or ESG or sustainability slogans? Or has there been a focus on cost cutting and priority on profit preservation? I'd like to hear your view about how business is handling things. And I'd also like you to come to the point about the informal workforce that Guy was talking about, and really about, there's no doubt that price competitive business models have created the conditions for some of these unethical labour standards and practices. So how can we really get business to begin to adapt their business models to really create positive change?
Yeah, so there's a lot in there, Fiona, so let me go fast if I may, but I totally agree with Guy on the social protection side. I think, unfortunately, we needed COVID to point it out, but a lot of these things were already apparent before COVID. We've always talked about the 800 million people that go to bed hungry every day, not knowing if they wake up the next day, the 4.5 billion people that live on less than $5 a day still. So the 2 billion informal workers that are now being exposed, the racial dimensions that come to us. So I think this has been drinking from a fire hose for many of the business leaders, and an awareness that is certainly at a higher level now than it was before. I remember a guy coming to the World Economic Forum at the International Business Council, where all the CEOs were sitting about 5 or 6 years ago, and actually having the same story. I think many of them were listening, a certain level of empathy, but then they walked out and little happened. And this is what we're paying the price for. Any system where too many people feel they're not participating or ultimately excluded will ultimately rebel against itself. And I think that is what we're seeing. And and the cost of this are enormous. And to avoid this would actually be far less in cost, and we would be all better off. So what has happened in the good side, on the business side, if I come back to the business, is probably this higher awareness, and companies, certainly the responsible companies, have accelerated their plans to do something about it. On climate action, we talked about that, but we've definitely seen an acceleration from the countries, from the financial market, from the business community, partly driven by technology, partly driven by risk, stranded assets, and all the things you know. But there's a real acceleration on movements towards a more sustainable model. More businesses are starting to internalize nature, biodiversity. There are targets coming out, just like we have the TCFD targets on financial disclosure. We'll have targets soon on nature disclosure, if you want to. So that's a good thing. I also think that broadly, for people that have caught on to this, the S in ESG is also now more on the foreground, not where it needs to be, but probably a bigger step change than we've seen. Employee well-being is now one of the major concerns of investors as well. You're seeing many of the shareholder meetings now having clear questions around that, and investors actually valuing organizations that have more robust relationships with their own workforce, with their value chain. And that has become definitely a top priority. And you see companies stepping up. Unfortunately, often the same companies, Tata Steel, who takes care of its employees in India, undoubtedly, or Unilever guaranteeing minimum wages throughout its value chain, or Pepsi supporting communities and local suppliers, or Danone with their initiative on guaranteeing wages and employment. So these are the leaders, but unfortunately, they're still far and few in between. If I look at what has hit the headlines, is that the CEO salaries in the US again have gone up at a faster pace than before, whilst the workers' salaries have stayed flat or gone down, really. The COVID donations of companies are being celebrated by the ones that do it, but they're a pittance compared to the profits that these companies have earned during COVID again. So we need to put the ambitions and accountability a little bit more under the microscope. Investors themselves, undoubtedly, as you can testify, need more transparency, and they want these comparabilities, if you want to, between companies. And then hopefully we can push forward on the standards much quicker. Can companies solve this all alone? I don't think so. I really think it needs the governments and the frameworks. There are many perverse frameworks in place that actually prevent companies from getting there. Companies alone can also not move these markets. So when it gets to things that Guy talked about, like the just transition, or the wage increases that the Biden administration was proposing, or the tax changes so that we all pay a minimum or fair share of tax that Roger talked about, or the minimum social protection plans, they need to come from governments. Now, what can business do? Into your second part of the question, there's obviously a lot of things, but I think the first thing that we have seen is that business that operates under a longer term multi-stakeholder model with purpose at the core, something we certainly aspire to in Unilever, have done better. The reason the financial markets are involved now a little bit more is because ESG is better performing. We've now seen that companies that are more purpose-driven have 20-30% higher returns than the companies that aren't. So I think the people are already voting with their feet. Companies like Ørsted or Tesla or many others that are moving towards that future are doing financially better, whilst the laggers on labor standards or on environmental standards are seeing their market values being diminished. That has been a great catalyzer. What companies now need to do is, I think, is a few things. Internalize the global goals, make them part of your strategy. I would argue, make it the strategy. Try to think how you can move from CSR, corporate social responsibility, or being less bad, to becoming a net positive company. If you cannot show how you are making this a better world, the world is not going to let you keep being around. Then the second thing, after you work on your own business model, is work in your value chain. Too many companies still think they can outsource their value chain, and by doing so, they can also outsource their responsibilities. That doesn't work anymore. We have to take full responsibility, not only on our footprint in society, but of our total handprint. And then the third thing is work on these broader transformations. It's very difficult to be in government nowadays. They're becoming shorter and shorter term. It's a polarizing business to be in. It's very difficult to move things forward. Business needs to help de-risk by getting together with governments, with civil society, and do this in a coordinated way to form these newer partnerships. And then last but not least, on the advocacy side, we do need to speak up. We need to speak up when democracy is undermined and voting rights are changed. We need to speak up when workers are not represented, when communities are not in the middle of the issues that we want to solve, and hopefully getting a higher level of moral consciousness, if I call it, from the business leaders to attack these issues. We have a few that we celebrate. We bring them together to create more critical mass, but we are far short, frankly, of what is needed. And the one I'm actually most concerned about, and would be good to get Guy and the other panelists' input, is actually the commitments to human rights. We've seen that being eroded in 87% of the governments around the world during COVID. Many have stepped up not to provide solutions, but to take more power. And if we don't get the workers' rights there, the rights of organizing, human rights, rights to dignity and safe working environments, and yet we see governments in many of the places in the world during COVID moving into a different direction. And I think it requires business to speak up much more than it currently is doing.
Yeah. Okay. So Felicitas, then let's talk a little bit about the importance of decent work systems in alleviating poverty. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your work and the journey that you've embarked on since 2006, but also just coming to that question about supply chains. So how can we work to create really more equitable supply chains, with particularly in industries like the coffee industry, where the farmers and suppliers are paid decent wages and have the same benefits like the ones working at, you know, the end of the chain?
Thank you for that question, Fiona. When we started Coffee for Peace, we were just thinking of maximizing and growing spaces of peace all across the country. See, I work here in Mindanao, and Mindanao is southern part of the Philippines. And if you look at the history of Mindanao, it is a place where there are several fronts, conflict fronts. And the indigenous people here are the poorest and the most marginalized sector in our society, where they experience neglect and discrimination in provision of basic social services, and also presence of armed conflict exacerbated poverty incidents in their area. So we arrived in Mindanao with this happening. I am coming from Manila, which is more urbanized place in the Philippines. So major factor causing this food insecurity and poverty among these indigenous people are the loss of their ancestral domain, the land that they farm. And sometimes these are contracted by government to big multinational corporation, and they come to the place, they displaced these people who have lived in that area for a long time and put up their big plantation. So that's one factor. Another one would be the environmental degradation, which we see the destruction of forests, we see pollution in waters, lots of mining companies are here in Mindanao, and we have seen the impact on the farmers. So working in that situation, how do we bring peace in this land? And the meaning of peace in Coffee for Peace are more of 4 basic relational harmonies. And this is harmony with your creator, harmony with yourself, harmony with others, and harmony with the creation. So it's the totality of what's around us. So peace is not just absence of conflict. So I will experience peace if I can put food on the table, if I can send my children to school, if I can have proper health care, if I can live in a secure place. So those things are needed to be addressed. So what we did in studying the situation in the community that we entered in, we saw, because when we arrived, it was the height of conflict. 2006, there were war between the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and the government of the Republic of the Philippines, trying to make the war stop and the killing stop. We have run out of ideas, so we said, let's just offer coffee and put them together to converse and have dialogue. So we did that. We put up a small space and invited the two conflicting parties and asked them to discuss things. And we served coffee. And this gave me an idea to put up Coffee for Peace as a business, because I saw coffee as the possibility of making it a vehicle to carry the message of peace. Because I observed, once they were drinking coffee, they stopped killing each other. And they are starting to dialogue and converse. And they are starting to converse about their position. What is your position? What's the other party's position? What are your interests? What are your needs? So this position, interests, and needs, as they discuss that, they could give up some of the positions that they have for the purpose of interest and need of the community. We also discuss about the context. What are the problems around? What are the attitude of people around, and what's the behavior? So discussing and integrating all of that in our economic approach. So that answers how to lead them out of that conflict situation. Not perfect, but at least it's a start. So studying the value chain, we started learning about how do you process the coffee seed. But first ask, what does the market want? What kind of coffee do they want? Do we have that kind of coffee? So we observed and looked at how the coffee farmers are processing their coffee. And we said, if we arrange things and change some things in your processes of coffee, would you welcome that? We would experiment together with you so that you would see how differentiated income would benefit your community. So we experimented with 20 individuals. 5 of them followed that processes. And after 3 years, the sleepy community, sleepy town, when they said to us, oh, there's no buyer of coffee, no income, we're so gloomy and hopeless. 3 years after that, they were so vibrant. I told them, you don't need to go down from the mountain to sell and bring your goods to the market. The buyer will go up because they would want to see this beautiful place around. And they wanted to see you, farmers, working on your coffee, and they would want to taste the coffee that you're serving. And in 3 years' time, that happened. And in right now, we had a Philippine coffee quality competition, and these farmers that we focused on training, they became #1 champion, following the standard of the Specialty Coffee Association over there, North America and Europe. So now the farmers are more confident. So I think if you lead them to know what to do so that they would add give what the market wants and you let them experience small winnings, then it is them who would be the storyteller to other farmers, to other tribe, to other communities. And that's how you provide decent work, because they were able, as a cooperative, they were able to provide jobs around their community. They don't need to go to urbanized town to look for jobs. So
That's fantastic.
one.
That's fantastic. Great work. Roger, I want to bring you in again now, and I want to really turn to labour protection systems, and we'll obviously focus on Norway, and really the role of trade unions during the pandemic. So, what role have trade unions played in protecting and upholding the rights of workers in Norway, but in our other countries? And what challenges have you faced in trying to do that? And I'd really like your views on what's been really the impact of COVID-19 on employment rates and labour rights. Has the labour protection systems in Norway been activated during the pandemic? Have they been sufficient, or have they been found lacking?
Yes, a lot of questions, Fiona. But of course, in Norway, it's quite a contrast to the Philippines. And you also must remember that in Norway, the social dialogue has been extensive and quite good for many decades, and it's is rooted in historical social dialogue. So, and I emphasize on this historical social dialogue because it has built up trust, in the society between employer confederations and employee confederations and the government, and you cannot use that trust during a crisis unless you have built it up during non-crisis. You cannot start now building up trust and social dialogue. So I think that's a very important lesson, in the aftermath of the crisis, that we have to, have a good social dialogue during normal times, because only then we see the value of trust during crisis. So in Norway, we participated in building up the social security systems, the compensation systems for businesses and also for workers, almost at the beginning of the crisis. I say almost because at the very beginning, we have a right-wing government, and they were, acting from their the top of the head and introduce some kind of unsocial measures meeting the crisis. But of course, we protested, and after a week or so, we were invited and were able to turn the measures so that they hit those who were the worst hit by the crisis, and we extended the social security programs, and we have actually been in a social dialogue with the government and with the employers in, so to speak, every measure is taken in Norway. So this has shown how important role the Confederation of Trade Unions play in the Norwegian, political economic system. And of course, some of our schemes were not sufficient, and also we did a lot of the workers working from home offices. We see that some of the the worker protection laws were insufficient. So, but we have been in dialogue with the government, trying to adjust these according to the crisis. And of course, the Norwegian labor market was hit severely as well. Unemployment rose rapidly, but we got a system quite early. Is quite a system where you can get unemployment benefits without losing a job, so you can return to your job when the crisis is over. So you know, the unemployment rates are hopefully camouflaging the employment in the aftermath of the crisis, because it's much more easier for the businesses to take back the workers, and even to get the government to take their wage bills during the crisis. So I will say that I repeat this because it's very important that you asked me what can we learn from Norway, and I think we can learn that during peaceful times, during normal times, during good times, you have to build up trust so that you can use that trust during crisis, and that's what we have done in Norway, I think.
Thanks, Roger. I think that is a really good point. Guy, I want to come back to you, and I want to pick up on a point that Paul mentioned. So a lot of private sector companies have implemented measures to protect their workers and to avoid layoffs, and we've just heard from Roger as well. But others have received really large bailouts and they've still laid off their workers. So what type of pressure can we place on the private sector to do really more to protect their workers?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely true, isn't it, that an extraordinary effort has been made, both by private actors, by enterprises, but also by governments, because, I mean, if you look at the furlough systems, the partial employment systems that have come into operation, many of these are publicly funded and have been funded to an extraordinary, unprecedented degree. We all understand, at least I think we do, that these temporary measures are limited in time. We have, of course, to avoid the mistake, which I think, and I think Paul has said this as well, we made in 2009, 2010, of pulling back into the what was politely called fiscal consolidation much too quickly around 2009, 2010, and that had a major implication for the recovery process. So we shouldn't move too quickly to withdraw the measures that are in place. But looking forward, you know, I think we have to make a clear distinction between what we should properly expect of governments, the state. And my argument here is that we certainly have to understand that when it comes back to the issues of protection, be it against unemployment, be it against health risks, the primary responsibility lies with the state. We do need comprehensive welfare systems. The role of the private sector there, I have to say, and it's something we might wish to come on to, is to pay taxes at a level which enables the state to operate and have the tax take, which enables welfare states to operate appropriately. And then we then come on to, and this brings me more to what Roger's just been saying, the relationship between private enterprises and the workforce and the type of dialogue that exists between their representatives. And here I think something really important has come out of the conversation. It has been remarkable and it's been positive to see the extent to which social dialogue has been used in the depths of the crisis to very quickly solve problems. I think social dialogue has been a very potent and very effective problem solver in the context of crisis. But I want to reiterate what Roger has said. I think it's wrong and it will be suboptimal to simply regard social dialogue as a crisis response, something which can episodically be called upon to solve immediate problems. It needs to be a permanent process in good times as in bad, because it does create, you know, that extraordinarily important, if intangible, commodity of trust. And one thing I think we have in the world of work today is a very big deficit of trust. And this manifests itself in the notion which everybody seems to be talking about. I don't think we've given it very clear definition, but there is widespread feeling that we need a new social contract. I mean, you can hardly open a newspaper or look at a website without someone saying we need a new social contract. Now, what they actually mean by such a social contract is less clear, but I sort of agree with it. I think we do, because there is a feeling in society, I don't think I'm the only one to feel this, that something has gone wrong, that the levels of inequality that we've lived with and are seeing, brought to the surface by the pandemic, that's wrong. It's not just a question of some people got a bit more money and some people a bit less money. We're living in segmented boxes of society. There are structural injustices that have come from these levels of inequality. Access to health, access to education, social mobility, intergenerational mobility. So we've got to reconstruct this notion of fairness and social contract. It's about social cohesion in our societies, and trust is a big piece of this. Rogers, I think former boss, the late president of the Norwegian Confederation of Trade Unions, once told me that in Norwegian, the word trust reads the same, read backwards and forwards. Tillit, I think it is. What does he mean by that? It means that what you put into it, what workers put into it to benefit employers at some point, is reciprocated by what employers put into it to benefit workers. It's a public good. We all benefit from functioning processes of social dialogue based on trust. It's a long-term relationship, not a short-term one. So all of these things, I think, need to lubricate what we need to build back better. And in case I don't get another chance to say this, we don't have to invent everything from scratch in the light of the pandemic. We have the 2030 United Nations Sustainable Development Agenda. If those 17 Sustainable Development Goals were made the signposts of the way we want to take the world of work, picking up everything that's been said today, we've got a pretty good roadmap for a way forward. We don't have to start from nothing. These are commitments already made. They need to be respected.
I couldn't agree more. I really like to think of the Sustainable Development Goals as the world's business plan. And if we implemented this business plan, we would be, by 2030, we'd be in such a much better place, and we don't need to start from scratch. So Paul, picking up on what's just been said by Guy and others, change can't really happen overnight, although, it'd be good if it could. And business models do need to consider all stakeholders. But how do you think that business can really engage in meaningful dialogue, building that trust with NGOs, with trade unions and the local communities, really to design much more sustainable business models? And have you got sort of any examples of businesses who are doing just that and really unlocking opportunities for value creation?
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. And without repeating Roger and Guy, but Stephen Covey in his book 7 Habits said it very well when he said, you cannot talk yourself out of things you have behaved yourself into. So the first thing that business needs to do has a broader behavior. If you just only myopically focus on maximizing the shareholder return, it's not going to work. You really need to look at optimizing the return to all of your stakeholders. And that takes moral leadership, that takes courage. As Guy was saying, many of the things that need to be done, we know how to do already, and we could be doing it today. But it's the lack of willpower or the lack of courage that prevents us from doing that. So one of the most important things is that we get the right leaders, we get the right boards, we get the right incentive systems around them so that they can behave in the right way to drive these things forward. There is nothing more important than indeed, for example, you take the climate change and the just transition, to have this social dialogue that both Roger and Guy have been referring to. If we cannot sit together like adults around the table between employers or employees or unions, governments, to debate these things, it's not going to happen. Where that is happening, and I've seen the same in my own life, we've had tremendous discussions, sometimes disagreements, but we always solve them with the discussions with the unions, for example. In talking with people like Ron Oswald from the IUF or Sharon Burrows, we always came out in a better place. And yes, what I learned was that even if it requires what some people might see as investments or costs, you're actually talking about investments in people. You're talking about strengthening an overall business. So if it is taking contingent laborers on the payroll and making them permanent, if it is providing social welfare on your tea plantations and building the toilets and energy for their housing and letting and possibilities to have their kids go to school, it always comes back in a better, more robust, stronger business model that increasingly also is proven to be more profitable. So what in silos seem to be trade-offs, actually, if you look at it as a whole systems approach, increasingly are profitable. Which brings me to the Sustainable Development Goals, and as you rightfully say, this wonderful business plan that we have. We asked Mark Malloch-Brown to, and you've seen that, to see how we could make the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals, 169 targets, understandable for business, because it's just too much, too overwhelming for business to get their hands around. And what we found was focusing on 4 simple areas: the health and well-being, mobility, energy transitions, cities, and food and land use systems, where there's, by the way, a lot of poverty in there. Just transforming these systems would unlock $12 trillion in value and create 380 million new jobs at the time that we need them most. It is now to the point, I hate to say, that on every of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, we are incurring more costs than it would cost us to implement all of the goals together. To implement all of the goals cost us $3 to $5 trillion incremental a year. We're already incurring $5 trillion on climate change or more. We're incurring 8 to 10 trillion on conflict prevention and wars that are going up. We're holding women back on goal number 5 that is costing the global economy 20 trillion. Our food systems that are totally broken have a per first cost of about 10 trillion in there. What we're doing is absolutely absurd in that respect. So as we can get together at critical mass, work in different partnerships across the value chain, making the future of humanity not a point of competition and win-lose, but putting that ahead of anything else we're doing, is certainly the leadership and the courage that we need from our CEOs. Now we start to see some of that with Just Transition. If you look at the Just Transition, for example, the B team, which I chair, which has Sharon is part of that, has convened the major green energy makers, companies like Ørsted, etc. There is a concern that although the move to green energy will create more jobs, there is a genuine concern that these jobs might be less well-paying jobs. So how can we protect these workers? Companies like Enel have made tremendous plans in Italy to convert, or the government of Alberta in Canada to be able to convert when you get into transitioning these industries from the old world to the new world. And their business needs to be part of and needs to actively work that. At the end of the day, it is the leadership and it is these transformative partnerships, I believe, that are going to do it. Look at Emmanuel Faber, Danone, a very good company. I think he's one of the great leaders that we have. He started this business for inclusive growth, brought together 40 other companies, works in dialogue and full cooperation with the unions and civil society to just have some basic things like the Ruggie frameworks for human rights, or in your supply chain, or building safe workplaces, or being sure that everybody gets continuously educated so that they can participate. These are just the basic things of humanity to make societies function. And every business should understand that. The smart ones already get the benefits from it. The ones that are lagging behind perhaps need a little bit more of a push from the economic forces, because they will do less well over time, but we can't wait for that. But hopefully also increasingly from governments.
Thanks, Paul. So Felicitas, talking about business models then, and you were talking about what you've done. So how transferable do you think is your business model? And so can providing conflict groups with knowledge about agricultural production, be an effective method of creating peace, etc., in other situations? Do you think that the model that you've done is something that can be transferred to others?
Thanks for your question, Fiona. I would say that it has to start with the mindset first. Yes, it is transferable, but if the recipient's mindset is not ready, then it cannot be transferred. So it has to be the community or the group that you are wanting to share this are ready. So they have to do their self-assessment. Do I need to change? What do I want to have? What is my vision? And having that vision is the driving force for this community to move forward. So whatever product they have, as long as we deal with the mindset of a person, the being. So I'm talking more of the being of a person. Who are you? And as a social entrepreneur or as an entrepreneur or as a change maker, who are you? And what changes do you wanted to drive forward? What would you want to do? What is your purpose in life? And being mindful of others. So with that kind of framework, then we could start something. So in social work and community development, it is not what you think could transform the community, but it is what the community thinks could transform them. Mm-hmm. So you have to lead them to think that they needed this and that this kind of move is what would help them as a community. So what we could do is just guide them to let them think and be the one planning. So whatever product they would have, then just correcting that value chain and thinking of the stockholder, the shareholders, the one who provides capital, the employees that they will hire, the processors or distributors, the consumers, and the supplier. So having that totality as part of your inclusiveness, then you know that you will be in the right direction. Mm-hmm. So the real problem here, when we got out of World War II, of course, I was not yet alive at that time, but my parents are telling me stories. You know, we are into this industrialization, and without taking notice of what's its effect to the environment. So it's just making profit, money, and now we are seeing the effects of what we have done, and we have to review things. In the Philippines alone, there are 85% of small entrepreneurs who are trying to make things happen for themselves. But these people does not have any direct contribution on the laws made by the government, because it is the top elite companies that make the law for the businesses. So there has to be that meeting place so that you can encourage these small entrepreneurs, or what Guy was saying, informal market, to be in the system and to contribute so that everybody would benefit. But if we encourage them and still these policies are stifling them and suppressing them, then we cannot do anything. So it has to be working for both the people who are trying to make businesses and the policymakers who are making policies to be catering to these people who are rising up. So
fantastic, thank you. Roger, a few people have mentioned, Guy's mentioned it, everyone's sort of mentioned the issue about that a lot of these measures that have been put in place are temporary measures, and we've talked about, hoping that these will not be removed in many countries too soon, as what has happened after the global financial crisis. So how can the trade unions really ensure that the temporary measures adopted during the pandemic can be made into policies and systemic reforms globally?
Yes, it's a very important question. Of course, also for us, we have been focusing on dealing with the crisis. So we have also been focusing on temporary measures, but we see that many of these measures are actually quite important for bringing the economy and the society back. We have long experience that a pressure downwards on the lowest wages, a pressure for temporary work, informal work. We now see the value of investing in competence, for example. We have also been able to lift the unemployment benefits for those who have the lowest wages. So this work starts now to reach awareness of the need of making these temporary measures permanent. So we have just started that work, and in Norway, as I said, we have a social dialogue, and we will use this social dialogue. We will use the crisis to talk about the need for replacing these temporary measures with permanent ones.
Okay, thanks, Guy. I just want to make sure that we get this question in that's come from one of the audience members, and it's for you, Guy. And it says, in the pandemic, how will the ILO assist in building an inclusive future with decent trust-based work? And where will the new jobs be coming from?
Well, to take the second point first, Fiona, where are the new jobs coming from? I think we know where the potential for job creation is coming. I think, whether we like it or not, we're entering into processes of extraordinary transition at work. There is the transition towards carbon neutrality. There is the digital transition with everything that implies. And I think we're focused very much on that in the light of the changes we've had to make to working practices in the course of the pandemic. There's a demographic transition. We're living in a world where there are aging populations in some countries, generally the richest ones, and young populations in others. And that demographic transition is going to have to play itself out. And I'll just add to the list globalization and changing societal preferences about the way we work. But where will the jobs come from? Well, the green jobs, the green economy is fundamentally important, and Paul has spoken to this. If you look at the aggregates, you could be optimistic about this. We've estimated that by 2030, actually implementing the commitments of the Paris agreements would create 24 million new jobs in the world, whilst destroying 8 million existing ones. But you come out on top. But the problem with this is we don't live in a world of aggregates. People live as individuals in communities, and those jobs are going to change and to move. And we have to work very, very hard to make sure that the transition is a just transition, which reconciles ecological imperatives with social progress. The care economy, my goodness, haven't we seen from this pandemic that we need to invest and create jobs in the care economy? Infrastructure in every sense of the word, digital infrastructure, physical infrastructure, social infrastructure. We're getting a bit of a lead from across the Atlantic on infrastructural investment, but this is an enormous job creation scheme. And if you step back and look at the thing in its totality, I think it's fair to say that the 2030 agenda, as well as being that business roadmap that you've referred to, is also an extraordinary job creation scheme if we invest in it and make it happen. What's the ILO going to try and do? We just started our annual conference. We're going to negotiate a document about a global response to build back better from this crisis. So we'll be picking up on many of the issues that we've been discussing today. And my ambition as well is to launch a series of national tripartite dialogues in our member states, bringing together governments, workers and employers on working out in very practical ways and through this issue of dialogue and trust, how to make all of this happen. Otherwise I fear we can have these conversations in the air. They really have to come down. They have to hit the road in enterprises, at the national level, in communities, to make these things happen. And we need the finance to make the investments a reality as well.
Thanks, Guy. Well, I think that is a perfect place to leave it, and we're running out of time. I think what I've taken away from today, one of the key things that I've taken away is actually that whole issue of trust. And I think it was articulated extremely well that we have to build up trust in the good times to be making sure that we can work together when things go bad. We can't just expect everything to work if we don't establish that trust. That we are trying to build back better, but we've got a long way to go, and it is still yet to be seen whether that will materialise. But there's a huge amount of opportunity. We've particularly talked about the role that the Sustainable Development Goals can play in leading us out of where we are today and to actually build back better. And if we're talking about building back better, that it should really be underpinned by the Sustainable Development Goals. I do have to say that one of the other things that I've taken away from today is that with people like Guy, Roger, Paul and Felicitas there and playing the roles that they do, I feel more confident that we might actually get there and that we won't repeat the mistakes of the global financial crisis. So I really want to thank Business for Peace for hosting this session. I want to thank the speakers for their time, because I know that you're all incredibly busy people. So thanks to Roger, to Guy, to Felicitas and Paul for your time today, but your ongoing commitment to making the world a better place. And I hope that we do actually get there. And thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thank you.